know me, but I'm excited to have Dr. Sarah Elzay here. She came last year, was part of a panel of several other people talking about about the planes and things like that. And I really enjoyed her program a lot and wanted to get her back here because her program revolved around native bees, which I learned a lot in her short little segment that she got to do. So I really wanted a standalone program with her here. So I'm really excited to have her. So go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Good evening. Thanks for coming on a hot, windy, blow dryer day. So I like to include a little bit of poetry. So this is by Bliss Carmen, and it's a very long poem, just one stanza. A swarthy bee is a buccaneer. I just like to think of them as swarthy. A burly, velveted rover who loves the booming wind, which is appropriate for where we are, in his ear as he sails the seas of clover. Again, appropriate. So if you ever get the chance, look up that Carmen poem. It's beautiful and all about bees. I wish you a very happy Pollinator Week. It's the National Pollinator Week. This is sponsored by the Pollinator Partnership, but it's every June, halfway through June. Check out pollinator.org. There's lots of fun programs and resources available, which I'll come back to. Today is the first day of Pollinator Week. I'll spend just a smidge time on an introduction so you know why I'm standing up here talking to you about bees and telling you not to have a monocultured lawn. Then I'll talk to you about some basic biology, ecology, and some of the bee diversity. And then I'll kind of focus in on the declines that everybody talks about and what we can do and how we can help and tools that we can all use to improve our understanding and maybe reverse some of these declines. I'm a pretty casual speaker, so please interrupt, raise your hand. I brought resources. I only printed a few because I just didn't want to waste paper, but please, get up, go get the book. If you would like to look at it, that's perfectly fine with me. I wanted to spend some time on information, but I'd really like to, show you the bees if you want to check out the microscope at the end, set you up with some QR codes so you can visit some of the resources. So, this is a video I took. This is, sorry, it's a little jumpy, but Indian blanket or blanket flower. And this is one of my favorite groups of bees. That's actually a sweat bee, so it's a very, very small bee. And what I love about the video is you can really see that tongue action. And what's interesting is this is one of the most common sweat bees, and it's a Laceo species. Almost nobody can tell the different species apart. But it's actually considered a short-tongued bee. So that glossa, the tongue of the bee, is actually relatively short across bee groups. And that just goes to show it that, to me, it looks, pretty long, at least as long as its head. But that's actually considered a short-tongued bee. So it's just going to keep playing. Sorry, it's on loop. So I'm Sarah. I am at Fort Hays State in the Department of Biology. I'm a landscape ecologist, but I teach a lot of rangeland courses. But my focal group of organisms has always been native bees. I did my master's at the University of Wyoming, looking at energy development changes on the landscape. My doctorate at Oklahoma State, looking a little more at row crop agriculture. And a brief postdoc doing urban ecology with honeybees. And it only lasts a year because I'm not an urban person. I've loved insects always, but what I really love is the interactions. And I'm trying my very best to share my love of those special critters, even the cockroaches, with anyone who will listen, but I like to dress my children up as bees. That's the first Halloween for both my kids. My husband is dressed as a flower. Everybody kept calling him a turkey, though, which was a bummer. But so this is a part of my life through and through. And I just, because none of my work would be possible without my funding sources, I token funding source page. So I always got to do this, and it's a cringy moment. But our understanding of native versus non-native is a little bit fluid, and it can be a little bit confusing. Thank you, social media. But one thing I just like to raise awareness of, and by no means am I giving a negative opinion, but honeybees, the tried and true producers of honey that everybody loves, are not in fact native to the United States or North America at all. Now there are relatives that are native, relatives of this type of bee that are native to South America and Central America, but they really have not existed here in millennia. So I like to think of honeybees as kind of a domestic animal, like cattle or sheep. They're very useful. We will never see them disappear, which is good because they pollinate crops. But humans have interacted and artificially selected traits for so long that it's hard for me to think of them as wild anymore. There are a lot of feral hives at this point, but I just kind of put those in their own category of a domestic group. They originated in Asia, maybe Africa, but most scientists agree Asia. And we have been manipulating them or harvesting wax or honey for over 10,000 years. It really took off in the 1850s when our hive boxes changed in design and we had those free-form hive boxes where you could remove panels and harvest wax and honey individually, check the broods, find the queen. So that really changed. And they contribute, along with our natives and other pollinators. In the US, a low ball estimate is $18 billion every single year. Worldwide, it's estimated to be somewhere around $200 billion every year. And they're just a little bit different. They're what you might think of as a superorganism, so huge hives of tens of thousands of individuals. The whole goal of the hive is to protect the queen and the brood. So they really operate as a unit. They're not, they're very highly organized caste system. And so I value them, but we're not going to talk about them anymore. We're going to spend our time talking about native bees, which look a lot different and act a lot different. And I'll kind of come back to what's going on with colony collapse disorder towards the end, but I won't spend any much more time on that. So, native bees, sorry for the red X, it's kind of aggressive. Next time I'll choose a happier color. But native bees are everything else, almost everything else. There's a few other invasive bees or non-native bees that are here in the States. But really the vast majority of what you see either evolved here or came here so long ago that it's hard for us to determine when they arrived. In the United States, we have about 4,000 species. That's the current estimate. And here in Kansas, probably around 400. And this is actually not a great size comparison, but they vary quite a bit in the sizes relative to one another. So you've probably seen the very small sweat bees. Lots of people have seen great big bumblebees that are quite fuzzy. So they look quite a bit different than your honeybee. Almost all of them, 90% of them, are completely solitary. So that's what I mean when they're so different than honeybees, right? Honeybees never exist alone. If they do, they die. Native bees live almost their entire life alone because they are solitary. There's a bit of a range, so sometimes they might share the entrance to an aggregation of nests, but that's really it. A female will be gravid, she'll be ready to lay her eggs. She will prepare her own nest cells, provision them with pollen and nectar, lay an egg, close it up, fly away. And that's really the extent of the social interaction between, that vertical social interaction between parent and offspring. Bumblebees are a bit of an exception. They are native, they exist in hives, but no more than usually 10 to 100 individuals. So try not to think of it like honeybee hives, they're quite different. The other thing that's usually catches people off guard is honeybees nest in big cavities. Almost all native bees nest in the ground. They need kind of exposed, non-compact soil that's free of rocks and wood chips. What is the word I'm thinking of?
Mulch.
Mulch, thank you. Yeah, shout it out. This is casual. So they can have access to that soil. We actually have an incredible nest aggregation of sweat bees over by Big Creek, alongside the trail. If you go in like mid-April, you'll see them. I've seen them the last couple of years. I usually don't tell people exactly where because I'm afraid they're going to step on them. But I've talked to the city about roping it off. They're not a fan yet, but I'll work on them. I'll work on them.
I have a question.
Please.
That mason bee up there, I guess to me when you first put that up, I thought it looks like a wasp.
Yes,
So what's the difference exactly?
that's an excellent question. There's a few things. Wasps have simple hairs. I'll show you a picture of hair later. Bees have plumose, like branched hairs. That's hard to see unless you're looking at a microscope. The more and more you look at them, the easier it is to tell. The other thing, and this is kind of a funny feature, but if you catch yourself looking at a wasp, you'll see it. Their antennae are usually lower on the head or on that face. So bees are a little bit higher, wasps are a little bit lower. If you mistake a wasp for a bee, you're in really good company. I mean, I don't usually do it, but I can still do it. Because that's their closest ancestor.
Well, I have a next question. The wasps that I've encountered tend to be aggressive. So is the mason bee not as aggressive or?
Excellent question. No, in my experience, native bees are not aggressive at all, especially relative to social honeybees. I don't know how many times I've been stung by honeybees. I can count on one hand the number of times I've been stung by natives. They don't have anything to defend, so you can think of it evolutionarily, there would be no benefit to being highly aggressive because there's no offspring to defend, there's no food storage to defend, there's no queen to defend even. So just the evolution of the organisms is very different, so that they'd never develop that behavior. They're still aggressive if you step on them, but no one can blame them for that. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question back on the mason bees down on the ground.
Oh, yeah.
Is sand good or bad? I mean, we have an area that's sandy dirt, and I see all these holes in about April and May, and I'm wondering what's coming out of them. I've never seen
For
anything.
sure insects, probably some bees, but yeah, you don't want straight sand, so like a sandbox is not, because it doesn't hold its shape at all.
And it's sandy dirt.
Yeah, but that loamy sand that we have quite a bit of here is actually really great habitat, especially for those sweat bees. And if they're really small holes, that's probably what you're seeing. That and, let's see, I don't think I have an andrina up here. I have one in a couple slides, I'll show you. Yes, sir?
Are some bees poisonous and non-poisonous?
So, if we think about like the stinging action, all bees have some venom because the sting has a purpose. It's usually not that nearly as bad as honeybees. One of the reasons is that honeybees lose their entire venom sac when they sting you. So if you the next time you get stung, don't just swat it away and move it because it's already deposited all the venom in you. But you can actually see the stinger with the venom sac attached, and it actually will kill honeybees. Native bees don't have that behavior. If they sting, it's usually just the ovipositor. Venom may be injected, but it's not going to lose that whole venom sac in your skin. All right. So, a little bit more about, and I should mention, honeybees, again, that behavior of defending something, their venom is much more powerful. So like we were talking about, so this is a thread-waisted wasp. That's a mud dauber. And that's, a representation of kind of the lineage from which bees came. So a long, long time ago, kind of alongside the rise of flowering plants, angiosperms, this whole niche opened up where flowers were producing pollen that could travel. So the first type of pollination that evolved would be wind pollination or even water. But eventually that niche where insects could come to flowers, collect nectar and pollen, and then deposit pollen on other individual flowers, kind of led to this explosion of non-predatory wasps that eventually became what we know of as bees today. There's 7 different families. One of them only exists in Australia, so we're really not going to talk about them. And you can ignore the scientific names if you like. I was just trying to kind of highlight relationships. And this is one phylogenetic tree. We're not 100% positive this is what it looks like, but this is a best guess. So mining bees, I think we were talking about. I have better pictures because I hate those tiny ones. So mining bees, and I mean, maybe you can kind of see that hair looks a little bit thicker. You can kind of see how that hair could be considered branched. And so it looks a lot different than that wasp up there. And you can also see those antennae are a little higher. So mining bees are in that Melitidae family, but also in the Andrenidae. And really, you're going to see a lot more andrena or andrenids here. These bees are often have really tight relationships with one particular flower or flower genus, so they're considered specialists. Often, not always. They nest in the ground. That's why they're called miners, dig in the ground, to form their nests. Andrenids are really very common. I'm pretty sure there's only 4 melitids that have been found in the United States. Most of them are east, so we probably wouldn't find too many of them here. The long-tongued bees, this is the family that has your honeybees and your bumblebees. Usually they're large-bodied, super fuzzy, great flyers. They're kind of like the charismatic megafauna of the microfauna world. Everybody knows a bumblebee. They have a few specializations. Often the most social bees are found in this group. And they're a pain to try to identify because they're all very different. Leafcutter bees are, if you have a rose bush or sometimes lilac and you see these almost perfect circles cut out of those leaves, this is the family of bees, and many of them do this, that cut out bits of leaf. That's what they use to create nest cells, is just they kind of layer these perfect little circles, almost like hole punches out of the leaf, to form nest cells in pithy stems. So like the giant reed stems, they'll nest in there. This bee is every porch owner's with exposed wood's least favorite bee, because that's the bee that drills holes in exposed wood, even treated wood, if they need to. There are ways to deter that instead of just trying to spray them. But they run the gamut of social to solitary. The next group are one of my favorites, sweat bees. It's because they don't get a lot of love because everybody thinks they're wasps. They're usually very small and they're often metallic or sort of metallic. And you were watching a video of a sweat bee collecting nectar from that aster. They will often land on you and collect the salt from your skin. So the next time you're feeling brave and you see a small bee land on you or a small something, just observe it for a minute. Often that's what it's doing, is harvesting some of that. Yeah, you're a salt lick. Congratulations. But these are very common. These are some of the most important bees, native bees for pollination, because they exist everywhere. and they reproduce very rapidly. So these bees will produce, they'll have offspring in the early summer, and then those offspring will have mate and then have one more round in the late summer.
So what is their lifespan?
It's like 6 weeks. Which isn't, so like some carpenter bees, bumblebees, they'll live a couple of years potentially. Most of the long-lived ones are going to be in that Apidae family. Sweat bees, andrenids, these cellophane bees too are pretty short-lived. And of course, a lot of the others, with, I think, 24,000 is the estimate of native bees worldwide, so I'm generalizing a little bit. So, sorry, the last one is the cellophane bee. You might have also heard it called the plasterer bee. It produces this kind of substance that's liquid plastic wrap, very similar to it. It nests in the ground, digs out these small nest cells in the ground, and then it kind of pastes this material around the cell to waterproof it and reduce fungal infections on its offspring. And it's also one of the most fuzziest faced bees. I see them a lot in early blooming trees. So the next time you're walking around redbud or something early in the season, and you see this really characteristic white fuzzy face, might be a cellophane bee.
So you brought up fungus. I've heard a lot about fungus getting into like hives harvested.
Yeah.
How do they protect them? They can't. There's nothing that they produce that protects
Well,
them?
as far as I know, this group of bees is the only one that produces that substance. Honeybees are actually, they can get fungal infections, but they're so fastidious that they're very good at taking care of infections. They will sometimes lose individuals or lose part of the brood, their offspring that are in those cells. But they're really good at cleaning the hive. At this point, of course, we're in an arms race with pathogens. The bees they can evolve quickly, but is it quick enough against, fungal infections versus what we're treating our flowers and our hive boxes with? So that's a hard one. I think it's one of those things that you just accept. I think we all understand there's going to be a certain amount of loss each year for things like pathogens, for natives and for non.
Well, that leads me to another question. You hear all of these reports that there's this devastation, with hives and honeybees in particular. So what I'm hearing you say, it's not that drastic.
Oh, no, it's bad.
Oh, okay.
I'll get there. I promise. I'll come back to this, but honeybees, because I think of them as a domestic crop, when, we probably have trillions upon trillions of honeybees in the United States alone. So when colonies collapse and we lose a whole bunch of hives, it's not good, but are they close to extinction? Probably not. All of these bees are solitary, so if we lose a whole bunch to some pathogen that arrives that they're not used to or kind of can acclimate to, we could potentially lose an entire population or species much more easily of native bees. The reports for the year 2022 to 2023 for honeybees, I think the loss over the entire year in just the US is like 48% of all hives are gone, which is, that's only I think the highest was 50.1%. So we're still, it's not sustainable for sure. I caution, a lot of media says, well, we're going to lose the bees, and automatically we think of honeybees, and losing the bees might actually be losing the natives. Not that honeybee colony collapse is okay. This is what I mean. The media makes it a little hard to tease out the details. Okay, I'll be quick through this. So this is an osmia. So this is one of the bees. It's actually a genus of bee that co-evolved with alfalfa. So we often use It's one of the times we use natives to pollinate a crop. And all I'm trying to point out is that, insects have 3 segments to their body: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Again, one way to tell it's a bee and not a wasp is that it has kind of those fluffy hairs. Again, you can also kind of see, if you look mid-eye, that mid-compound eye, the antennae are above it or kind of right there. There are a lot of flies that mimic bees. The best way to tell if it's a fly or a bee is if it has 2 pairs of wings, which it's hard to see on this picture, I grant you. But flies' second pair of wings is very miniature. They're called halteres, and you might not even recognize that it has a second set of wings. If the other way to tell that a bee is a bee and not a fly or a wasp is that those hairs are designed to carry pollen. So usually on the hind femur, right here, or tibia, right there, you'll see pollen being carried. That's only on female bees, but that's the majority of bees anyway. So a couple things traits I wanted to pick out. So this is an image of the hairs. So this is what I mean. So we have this single hair, and you can see all of those spikes coming off of it. So think of it a bit like a pipe cleaner, right? A single hair looks like a pipe cleaner with lots of these kind of plumose spikes coming off of it in order to collect pollen, which it does really effectively. So we can see pollen grains in this image, just being caught up by all of that branching. I'll really briefly show you a video of bee vision, because we're running. So bees have 2 types of eyes: the compound eye. Critical error.
It's the guess one.
Thank you. Let's see, perhaps I'll come back to that. I'll come back to it at the end and show you. But they have 2 types of eyes. So they have these simple eyes up at the top of their head called ocelli. They're really important for navigation and determining light intensity. Their compound eyes are what is kind of really vital for them finding flowers. And it's made of a bunch of facets that kind of give them a pixelated or mosaic view. So if you're ever on YouTube, you can check out a video of that compound insect eye vision. It produces this kind of mosaic image that's receiving a lot more input than our retinas do. It just looks a little bit different.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there, certain flavor of pollen?
Oh yes, pollen is really different. I could spend probably a whole talk just talking about pollen. Pollen profiles, basically you're looking at lipids, so fats, proteins, and carbs, just like you are with any other food that we might eat. But what's really important is that protein content and fats for overwintering. So the protein profile of pollen is quite different. And it's a sex cell from a flower, so obviously it has quite a bit of protein in it. But it can be really different, and so bees will use different resources based on what timing, like at what stage they're in. So if they're provisioning a nest cell, they want really high protein, really high carb, low fat, because that bee just needs to produce cells, right? That larvae needs to produce cells and then pupate. Closer to the end of the season, they need something with less protein, more fat, so they can make it through the winter.
So each flower has a different flavor, more or less?
Each species of flower would be a little bit different. Obviously, among asters, they're going to be more similar than if you compare it to like a columbine or something.
So what about trees? We got bees that come into our Chinese elm just about every year, and they are noisy as all get out,
Yeah.
just going at that tree.
Yeah, trees are actually really important because they usually flower early. Elm perhaps not, but they usually flower early, so it's often that first resource for those early emerging bees. So things like, you know, the crab apples, the choke cherries, the one I just mentioned earlier. Red buds, thank you. Sorry, I have young children. Those are really important for those early arriving bees. And
Well, they're usually in our tree like July or August.
Yeah.
I mean, just,
swarming.
oh, it was terrible. And then they get all of this brown stuff all over the driveway. Oh my God, what a mess.
I'll blame the honeybees on that one.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
they need to clean up their mess.
A quick question, you were talking about the lipids, the protein and the carbs. How does that affect the honey then? I mean, is that how part of the grading comes in, or I'm
Well,
not sure.
so I should have mentioned this when I talked about honeybees. They're the only ones who actually make honey.
Right.
Everything else doesn't. And I don't know that much about honey. I do a fun honey tasting lecture, which I'll have to talk to Jeremy about sometime, where we just do like honey tasting, and it's fun to taste a monofloral kind of honey because it will really change the characteristics of honey. As far as the grading, I don't know how they grade. I don't know what that is
I guess-
on.
And you know, I guess that wasn't actually where my question was
Oh.
coming from, was the grading, but I said that.
Sorry.
I was just thinking how honey has been used for millennia as a food,
Mhm.
a strengthening food. And since you mentioned protein and lipids, I wondered if there was a content greater in, depending on the area, because what flowers they have
Mhm.
available and things to.
Yeah, that I don't know. So when, you know, honey is derived from nectar, they add a whole bunch of things to it because, right, they're swallowing the
Right.
honey, keeping it in their crop, regurgitating it. So it receives a lot of other enzymes and other materials. But it's a high carbohydrate food. The pollen is really where they're getting most of their lipid and protein. But I mean, that's not to say that there isn't some in the honey. I'm not sure. We'll have to add that to my tasting lecture sometime. This is your high protein honey used before a workout. So this is just I'll try to keep it not too slow, but what do bees need out of their environment? How can we determine where they'll live and whether or not that'll be as successful? They need basically three things: nesting habitat, forage, so food, and refuge. So nesting habitat, we've talked a little bit about. It's not just hive boxes, right? So we have bumblebees that might go into a unused animal den or a tree cavity. We have carpenter bees that might dig into rotting wood or your fence post. Many natives are going to be nesting in the ground, so we need exposed, non-compact soil. But that nesting habitat, what I hope you're getting out of this is it needs to look diverse. So the landscape, cannot be a single, homogeneous looking landscape if it's going to support bees. What we need is heterogeneity or diversity of that land. And that's mainly what I work on. Forage, so rather than just thinking they need enough flowers, they need flowers that emerge or bloom as soon as they emerge, all the way until the last bee species that's out at the end of the year, which is usually a sweat bee, will go into, its dormant state. And so they need a kind of continuous availability of forage. And as we've been talking, often that forage can look a little bit different. What's the nectar like? What's the pollen like? And are they getting the nutrients they need out of it? And then the last thing is refuge. So this is a little complicated to think about, but if you recall, most bees are solitary. So they lay their nest and they do their eggs in their nest or in the ground or wherever it is, and then they leave. Those bees may stick around for a little while and continue to pollinate our favorite vegetables or fruits. So they need a place to go to hang out overnight escape the really hot, dry wind, etc. It have water resources too. So again, refuge is not the same as nesting habitat, because that's not, they're only nesting for a brief time. So having refuge on that diversity of habitat is also important. So this is just kind of a catchy image I've been using for a lot of years. You're just looking at a produce aisle at a grocery store with bees and without. It can be a little misleading because this is just the produce aisle. Hamburger Helper will still be here. But we will lose things like all of our stone fruits. Alfalfa will be a lot harder to produce, so there goes the beef prices. Berries, most citrus would actually still be around, but we'd end up losing a lot of that diversity of our food if we didn't have bees. And so when we think about the decline of bees and the loss of honeybees, we probably wouldn't see as much starvation as you might imagine, but what we would see is a loss of a lot of micronutrients. So we might risk some more malnutrition rather than starvation were we to lose all of our bees. So if you think about the foods that we have because of insects, there are things that have trace minerals and vitamins that we need that are vital to us, but we don't need in huge quantities. But if we had no access to them, right, our physiology would take a pretty big hit. One statistic out there is about 30% of your food is present because of bees. I like to think about, what's the timing of the year? The strawberries, not possible without bees. All pollinators are important. There's a very particular fly that pollinates chocolate, or that pollinates cacao, so we wouldn't have chocolate without pollinators. Don't kill all the flies. Oh no, I know. It gets worse. Coffee is a bee-pollinated crop, and it's in regions that are changing rapidly because of climate change, and that pollination service to coffee is important to all of us. Even wine will become more expensive because some grapes do a lot better with bee pollinators. So if you think of things like grasses like wheat and corn, they will probably be fine. But a lot of those foods that make our food better, that make our diet better, would be harder to produce or more expensive. So, are we in the middle of an insect apocalypse? And this is a great image, and I forgot to put the citation of the artist on this picture. I have it. I will send it out if you're interested. But there was a paper that came out in 2017 where a researcher drove with a giant net on top of his car in Germany. And apparently someone had done this several years before, but they recorded the bioabundance, just how many insects they collected, and it had declined by almost 3/4. So 75% of the bioabundance was just gone. Which, if you think about driving down the interstate 50 years ago, I'm not saying anything about age here, some amount of years ago versus this summer, are your windshield wipers as dirty? Now that's all anecdotal, that's not scientific data. But there is actually quite a bit of scientific evidence that we are losing the abundance of insects and consequently bees, and the biodiversity of insects and consequently bees. Since that article has come out, there have been a lot of other studies to look at that. It's a little harder in the New World, North America, where our kind of historical data is a little bit shortened or limited. And so this is a more recent, not that 2017 was long ago, but actually this one's older, 2014. But what you can see, this is a bit hard to interpret, but the darker the colors, those species are losing, those taxa are losing a greater percentage of individuals in any given taxa. So forgive this terrible red drawing here, but Hymenoptera is the order that we're looking at. This is your bees, wasps, ants. And you can see that, you know, the decrease in the past 40 years has been a little bit steeper in Hymenoptera. Not that, you know, it's not steep in other orders, but it does seem like we're getting consistent results that we're losing quite a bit of our insect abundance and diversity. Why are we losing it? I'm going to kind of go back to bees a little bit here. This is a confusing image. I actually printed it out. It's very busy, but it's a great thing to have on your, I don't know, refrigerator or bathroom, wherever you like to do your reading. But it's a paper published, and I wrote the citation on the prints too, by Wagner in 2020. And he calls it the death by 1,000 cuts. This is why we're losing all insects. But there's just, it's so multifactorial, the causes of decline, that it's really hard to tease out just one. Like if we would just get rid of this particular insecticide, well, but that's really not going to do it because there's another pathogen that's also causing problems. And so I'll highlight a few things. So one of the most important is that we just do not have bee habitat. We're in mixed grass to short grass prairie right here. There's only like 10% of mixed grass prairie remaining intact. There is only like 1 to 3% of the tall grass prairie. Short grass prairie is doing a little bit better. So we have drastically changed the habitat that bees require, and that's been going on for hundreds of years. You know, agriculture has existed for over 10,000 years. So, you know, we will continue to produce food to survive. So this is just something we can't change really quickly. More to the point with technological advances, the intensity in which we use land, and that's not just agriculture and, you know, major monocultures and row cropping. It's also, you know, more pavement in urban settings, overloving our national parks. In every type of land, we are using it more intensively, and that's associated with declines in abundance and diversity of bees. Forgive me, but we are at that time where we're strapping on our New Balance shoes and mowing the lawn. So one problem, and this isn't just lawns, is monocultures. So a single species produced en masse in an area. So I'm picking on lawns in haze, but it's everywhere, it's not just here. But monocultures, if you were a bee and you were looking for refuge, nesting, or food, that would look like a desert. Worse than, you know, just nothing. Probably great for getting depredated on. So we have monocultures, you know, you drive a little bit out of town and there's wheat field upon wheat field upon wheat field. And I'm not anti-agriculture by any stretch. But monocultures in any sense of the word are going to create a bit of a food desert for bees. So kick it to the HOA and produce a chaotic lawn. Or, you know, at the very, you know, just an area where you have a little bit of exposed soil and a few native plants. Climate change is a really hard one to pull out what is changing because we aren't changing ubiquitously. Not everyone's getting drier, some places are experiencing more flood. But let's take Western Kansas. We're experiencing still a drought that has lasted several years. Likely droughts will become more severe and more prolonged. Extreme weather events. That's hilarious in Western Kansas because that just is your weather and I'm not from here so I can say that. But extreme weather events like, you know, what was it, 2 summers ago when we had 105-degree temperatures for like a week in early June and we lost a lot of cattle, that type of thing is just, you know, it might have happened historically, but what we expect is that it will continue to happen more and more often. Phenology is something I would love to talk more about, but it's a long, complicated talk. But the timing of life history events is something that anything who has tight interactions with, it matters a lot. So if you think about bees and flowers, bees typically rely on the temperature of the soil that they're nesting in to know when to come out in the spring. Flowers for germination, rely on temperature, but a lot on sunlight, daylight hours. So as the days lengthen, germination starts ramping up. So you could imagine that if climate change is producing warmer soils, bees might emerge just a little bit before flowers bloom or germinate. And then we have kind of this mismatch where the bees are out and need food now, and there aren't any flowers. Alternatively, another thing we're seeing a lot of is winter temperatures not getting cold enough so that the metabolic activity of insects is actually higher, meaning they're burning fat and they're emerging really skinny. And that's causing all sorts of terrible changes because they can't get food fast enough, or the eggs that they lay, they cannot, are rarely successful because of their body conditioning. Pesticides and pathogens are really tightly linked. What we're finding is that exposure to pesticides makes bees more susceptible to pathogens, and the use of antifungals changes their microbiome, which then allows parasites to infect bees more. It's a very complicated relationship, but I never kind of talk about these separately because we're using pretty extreme pesticides in the United States that have been banned in other areas. And we have a really high load of pathogen, particularly in our honeybees, that trickles into our natives. And then of course we have invasive species, the murder hornet, not great, although I hate that name, and non-natives like honeybees that are entering into native bee habitat, causing an increase in competition and exposure to pathogens. All that's to say is that this is leading to a whole bunch of synergistic effects, so all together affecting native bees that are making it quite hard. If one thing gets better, that is not going to save the bees in entirety. Oh man, okay, I gotta go faster. So how can we help? A few things, just use less. Bike. Haze is actually really bike friendly, I have found. Try to use fewer intense agrochemicals. So instead of picking up Roundup or XYZ, go for something like neem oil or spinosyn. Even those chemicals, they're still chemicals, they're still harmful to insects. If you're treating for pests, it's going to affect all insects. But what these can do, you can apply them so that they're dry by the time bees emerge. So if you apply them kind of at the end of the night or the end of the afternoon or kind of an hour or two before sunrise, I know that's asking a lot, they'll dry and they won't be harmful to bees. They'll be harmful to the insects that are chewing on your plants or sucking the sap out of them. I think we have to mention that maybe we don't get to have perfect lawns and perfect flowers. I have an infestation of sunflower moths on my sunflowers and coneflowers, and I can't spray them because it's going to kill everything else. So I just sacrifice some flowers to the pests. I think we just have to accept that that is what ecology is. It's playing out right before our eyes. And we could argue that humans are a pest in and of themselves, and we're not going to eradicate ourselves. So, hand removal, spray them with water. There are a lot of other ways that we could be less harmful. Another thing, we could support more native predators, parasites, and parasitoids. So don't squish all the spiders, don't try to capture all the wasps. That's hard. Allergies and health come first, of course, but just try to leave a little bit of habitat for our friendly arachnids. Whenever possible, choose native. So I printed some resources. I made a little business card with a QR code that will take you to a couple websites that are specifically for our ecoregion. So you can find native seeds, or how do you site prep a new garden patch, or what kind of native grass would be better so that I don't have to mow so often. Whenever possible, go down to the farmers market, support the local farmers rather than the Walmart farmers. No offense to Walmart farmers, but they're not shipping as far. Or at least look for those with friendlier practices. So they try to use fewer agrochemicals, or they're at least conscientious of when they apply them. And lastly, participate. So you showed up, thank you. But there's all sorts of great ways to engage and become a citizen science. We're in a low population area of the country. That also means we're in a bit of a data desert. So if you go to Kansas City, you can see a whole bunch of citizen science data, but Hayes just has a little bit, and we need so much more. So with that, I will show you a few tools to help you become a naturalist. I'd love it if you wanted to pull out your cell phones. I can help you download if you don't have them. If you could teach me something, I would be appreciative. My favorite general one is iNaturalist. I'll share this slideshow. But these are all hot links, so you can hop onto them. iNaturalist is great. You open the app, you take a picture, it'll give you suggestions of what you think it is. There are thousands of these apps now. Even like your camera now will just become an app. It's like Google View or something. I'm sure Apple has something too. But this is a great one for just anything: insects, plants, animals, fish, whatever. I really enjoy it, and they hire trained taxonomists to observe your images and identify them as best they can, if they can. It automatically gives it a location, a date, and a time. It'll even record weather data if you have that enabled on your phone. And that can actually take that image up to research grade, so that scientists can actually use that as a true documented data point. Bee Machine is new. This is coming out of K-State along with a couple other scientists. It is using machine learning, so it's AI engaged. I know, cringy, but it's pretty cool because the more images they get, the more accurate it becomes. The one thing I would say is never use, or I would not use Bee Machine alone. It is similar. You take pictures and it's going to guess at what bee you're looking at. I find that you're like the secondary information is really not as good as what you can get on iNaturalist. The Bumblebee Atlas. This is looking specifically for documenting bumblebees. It's a great resource, and bumblebees are great to work with because they're large, and I guarantee you after like a few hours you'll be able to ID at least 6 species of bumblebees. So that's nice. The other two resources, and this is what I put, if you have trouble with QR codes, I'd love to help you. But I put them on this little business card. The Pollinator Partnership is on one side, Xerces Society is on the other. Pollinator Partnership is really concerned with pollinators exclusively. They're the sponsors of Pollinator Week. They have lots of great resources. The Xerces Society is the only invertebrate-only conservation organization or nonprofit. And they're a great resource. They're engaged with the NRCS, the USDA, Pheasants Forever, Quails and they're just engaged with so many different land management organizations. Lastly, I didn't get through half of what I wanted to, but I did bring some of my favorite resources, the books if you want to check them out. And I brought some bees and my travel microscope with a light if you want to check out some bees, look at those fuzzy hairs, you might be able to. If you have any questions, I'd love to take them. I have a card over there. And yeah, thank you so much for, yes ma'am.
Do you wanna try and show the video?
Oh yes, thank you. Yeah, if you'd like. I would love to. I'm gonna mute it. And enlarge it. Can you see that? Okay. No. Miss Rachel. Okay. So it'll first show us an image of what the flower looks like to us. The second change is butterfly vision. Yay, butterflies, but we care about bees. The third image is bee. This is what bees see. So what you should see is even in those small flowers, small inflorescences, it's really pulling the bee in. So they see in ultraviolet much more than we do. So the flower, that looks monochromatic to us, just yellow, is actually, like you can see those spikes of color. I'll point them out here. But they're really, trying to draw that pollinator in right to where those nectaries are, right to where that pollen is going to brush up against their body. And it's a great video because we have a lot of these genus, these flower genuses.
Well, how did you figure that out? How did they figure this out?
That's a really great question. I knew someone was going to ask me, and I'm not a physiologist, but I will find out. I will find out.
So you had mentioned earlier that bees need water.
Mm-hmm.
Do they land on the top of like ponds or water bowls, or do they need droplets, or what's their water
They're
source?
really bad swimmers. They need, my daughter has a fish net. Every time we go to the pool, that's her job, is to pull out insects. Like what they need is kind of intermittent water availability. They get most of their water from nectar. So they rarely need, in a giant pond. But of course, in a monoculture, right before wheat harvest, the only thing that's out there is bindweed. So that's some flowers, and there's more flowers, of course, but occasionally they really do need to rehydrate with water. We live in a really dry climate, and our nectar can get really concentrated as it evaporates. So that has a lot to do with the flower and how it's going to behave, because it's going to conserve water, and one of the first places it's going to stop giving water is its nectar. So.
It's a little off topic, but it is. The prairies and the tall grass, you had mentioned this earlier. One of the conservation areas there is burning, which I understand and I agree that really is helpful. How does
You
that
said burning, right?
burning?
Yeah, okay.
So how does that affect insects, especially the bees? Does that affect them, or do they just leave for another area? Because the one, they burn millions of acres.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, so this is an interesting, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something. Because we suppressed fire for so long, we now have a huge fuel load. So we have a lot more thatch, just, old
Right.
grass. So it burns a lot hotter than it used to. It burns longer than it used to. So traditionally, historically, prairie fires would have just gone through quite quickly. There was nothing for them to kind of, no fuel for them to sit on and get really hot. So the fire intensity would have been much lower, and the length of time that fire went on would have been shorter. So that's one issue. So that low intensity fire wouldn't harm a bee that's underground, unless it's a very hot fire. Now we're covered in cedars. Fires burn really hot, and with all that fuel, they stick around a little bit longer, so the heat has longer to get down into the soil, dry it up, and harm nests. I think the risk of not having fire is greater than the risk of, in the short term, fire looks a little bit rough. But, if we don't, in my opinion, if we don't kind of try to reverse, at least in part. Now, some argue that the tall grass prairie, that burn frequency is somewhere between like 1 to 3 years. So some people burning the same patch year to year, that's probably not what that grassland was adapted for. And they might be doing it for other reasons.
Yeah, I think they said like 1 to 3 years, but a lot, that part of them, I don't know what, percentage, but do burn every year.
Mm-hmm.
They try to rotate, I'm sure. I think they have to, to maintain, and it does enrich the soil and things, but when you were talking about that, I thought, oh, wait a minute, how does that
Yeah.
play into?
Yeah, fire just looks a lot different. So out here, our burn interval is, if you consider you're in mixed grass, it'd be like maybe 5 years. Short grass, 7 or 8. But because of our human behaviors and change, that frequency probably needs to be a little bit higher for a period of time before. And burning patches rather than, the fire that comes through the Tri-County fire burning, millions of acres. That's not, or hundreds of thousands of acres rather. That's.
Well, this one woman, I guess she said she has a lot of land, and she said 1 million acres. So I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm pro burning, but responsibly.
Well, I am actually too.
Yeah.
I just think it's the natural way to do it. But that just came up in my mind when you were talking about the ones that live in the ground.
Yeah,
and the eggs and different things.
Yeah,
so.
the vast majority of bees out here are in the ground. Yes, ma'am.
How deep in the ground?
It depends. So there are some bees that will go 1 meter down, multiple feet. It kind of depends on. There are some bee genera that use the same entrance, so then you have lots of females that are tunneling instead of just a single one that has to build the whole thing. And so those, with the more adults you have building it, the deeper it can go. But some are just a few inches down. Most are, I don't even know if I could give a good estimate for most, but between 6 inches and several feet. So. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.